Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I appreciate everybody for their flexibility. Uh, it wasn't, I had messed up when I did the syllabus. I meant for this class to be online tonight because of the way my schedule was working. And it was a good thing it was because of some stuff that happened here. But thank you for tuning in for PA 509, Applied Political Economy. We're up to class 4. And it should be a nice class tonight because we get to cover, honestly, one of my favorite topics in this class and one of the most important topics with respect to understanding public administration. That hat's not going to look straight, so have to go that way. Sorry, Chris, about that. Yes, Keston.
Oh, wow, that was quick. You saw that fast. I was not expecting that. I'm sure we're going to get into this. And I'm sure I'm not the only person that has this question, but these chapters definitely were much more math heavy. Are we going to go over those? Or is the math portion really all that important to know really well?
The math isn't.
Okay.
Because it's an economics textbook, and because I will say this, the math in this book is a lot less than the math in the previous book I used. But I will also, and Lindsay, remember, I think Lindsay had that class up briefly. The math is not really that important. If I feel like there is something that I need to cover that's math specific, I will cover it specifically. Obviously, right. I think if you can use it to understand the theoretical concepts, that's great. But it's not, I'm not going to test you on it. I'm not going to expect you to know it. And I will say that in your field work and your actual practical work, the math really is not all that important. So don't worry about that.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Yes, no problem. No problem. I'm glad you asked the question. Christopher, I'm sorry about that. I checked my syllabus this afternoon while I was at the chiropractor and realized that I had put this down as a classroom and Zoom, and I meant to put it down as a Zoom, and I'm sorry about that. So tonight we're going to cover what I think is one of the more important topics in this class. And in my opinion, in my work in the last 25 years is one of the most important things that I focus on when looking at public policy, at a municipal level, and something I think we have to look at across the board in all levels of public policy. And that is with the issue of externalities, which is a form of social dilemma as we move into the second part of the Bueno de Mosquera text with respect to social dilemmas. I also want to apologize. I referred to this text as Vildovsky in the last class, and that was a mistake of mine. Vildovsky is the text we use in the Thursday class. Those of you who have the Thursday class know that. And I was just blanking and just made a mistake, and I'm sorry about that. So let's go ahead and get started. There's one item on the overview that I'm going to wait a week on, and that's the discussion of podcast number 1. And the reason why is that in the email that I sent out, I set the podcast assignment for Thursday, the 15th. So I know some of y'all went ahead and did it, but I do want to hold off on discussing it until next week because that's when that's after the due date. But the deadline for the podcast assignment is Thursday. But we're going to focus primarily on chapter 4, and it's a very important chapter. We'll spend just a second covering the introduction on social dilemmas because there's a few things to cover in there, but then we'll get into chapter 4 with externalities. And we will do a class exercise tonight, and I'll break you all up into groups to kind of work through an exercise. And then we'll talk about the week 5 assignment at the end. So are there any other questions? Okay. First of all, as we go into this chapter on externalities, we start part 2 on social dilemmas. This isn't up there, but did anybody, if you had a chance to read the part 2 introduction, did anybody happen to catch the definition of a social dilemma.
It is a situation in which every individual is acting rationally, and yet the outcome is suboptimal.
Excellent, excellent, Anthony. So,
Okay.
so this is where we actually look at the fact that even with the best of intentions and the best of design, a lot of times policy does not yield a desired outcome. Obviously, the desired outcome, as we talked about in the past, is an optimal outcome. And we're trying to achieve that optimal outcome. And for some reason, everything can work just about perfectly, and everybody can be acting rationally, and yet the desired outcome is not achieved. We end up with a suboptimal result or a non-desired result. And so the question becomes then, well, why is that? And the reality is, as we go into this from an economic perspective, is that there are a lot of additional factors that have to be considered with respect to what we're doing. And so that's why we're going to start off with the discussion of externalities. And so there are different types of social dilemmas. What are some examples of social dilemmas? What are the different types that are talked about in the reading?
One example that he gave was fisheries in, I can't remember where the fisheries were, but one example he gave was fisheries.
Okay, what about them?
That it would be optimal for everybody or for the parties involved to not overfish, but there's an incentive to overfish so that the other person doesn't.
Right. It's a concept that we'll deal with later called tragedy of the commons, that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But the idea being that even if almost everybody participates in a way that's consistent, the reality is that it rationally may be that somebody may act rational and overfish for whatever reason, and as such can cause a problem in such a given situation, like with a fishery, that somebody may that the whole idea of communal ownership and communal access doesn't necessarily mean that everything is maintained properly. We especially deal with this now with water. Not as much here in this part of the world, because we typically have more water than that our population necessarily needs, even with industrial use and of course residential use and recreational use. But in some parts of the country, particularly out west, and California being a prime example, the issues that they have with water rights and water quantity management with respect to not only its use by the population, a very large population, and not necessarily conditions that prone themselves to sufficient rainfall on a regular basis, but also the needs of the agricultural community in California, can create significant issues with respect to water quantity, and that's something that has to be actively managed, and you have to factor in behavioral characteristics even under rational conditions. What's another example?
It talks about the overprescribing of antibiotics and how it led to antibiotic resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first example in this text is talking about the efforts that were made not too long ago, or the discussion from the World Health Organization. You know, we have this problem now with respect to disease and with disease management, or really with respect to disease management, in that, you know, people get sick and we're not able to effectively treat them because of the fact that antibiotics, which have been around for now a couple of generations and have proven very effective in helping to eliminate the potential mortality of things that we now consider as more of inconvenience, which used to be actually life-ending illnesses. We've gotten to a point now where, in a lot of cases, people are in a position where they're not able to fight these various things themselves, and they're immune to the antibiotics that are available due to previous overprescription. So that's something definitely we have to think of. Any other examples or other types of social dilemmas?
Public goods
Mm-hmm.
would be one.
Excellent. And we'll definitely get into that here in a second, but the whole idea of what is a public good, and once we define what a public good is, and how do we properly manage it, or how do we properly distribute it, that's very important. And it's one of the more challenging aspects of public policy. And a lot of the public good distribution is handled at the state and local level. There is some also at the federal level, and there is even some now that's talked about from an international perspective, more from a bilateral or multilateral perspective, even though there are efforts to try to make it omnilateral with binding international agreements. But most of that from international perspective is either bilateral or multilateral. So the goal that we try to achieve when trying to manage all of this, the goal that we're trying to achieve often in public policy is this goal of this state that's known as equilibrium. What do we mean by equilibrium?
When supply and demand are equal.
Right, when there is yeah, that's basically it. It's that there is a sufficient supply to meet demand. That's one way. I mean, that's basically the easiest way to look at it, is that when you have a position where supply and demand are matched, and you achieve what's known as an optimal price, which means that the provider of, if it was in a private market, the provider of the service is able to make money on it, and it's also affordable to the consumer. When it's a public good, it's the idea that we are able to recover the cost of producing and managing the public good. So, for example, going back to the issue of water, the most common utility that you will find at the local level is the water utility. Most of the population of this country is on a potable water system, and we are responsible for we're responsible for treating that water and then distributing it to customers. And our goal is to sell it at a price to the customer, a user-based charge, that it covers the cost of service. Now, that cost of service includes operations. It also incorporates capital maintenance, which is very important, as we learn with what's going on currently in Jackson, Mississippi. But we have a responsibility, but our goal is to sell it at that price to where we can properly maintain the utility. And in a financial means, when you're running a utility, you're running it as a business, but you're running it as a business with the idea that you're not necessarily trying to make a profit off of it, but you're certainly trying to recover your cost and have some money left over for capital improvements, debt service, as well as for maintaining operations if situations change. So you want to build some degree of cushion. So you build a little bit of a margin, of an operating margin in there, but you're not really treating it as profit. It's more of as a reserve, as being able to establish a reserve. So that's the goal when we try to provide a public good such as water as a utility and charge it on a use basis. So when we talk about these policies, and it talks about this concept of collective action, we come up with the reality that there is obviously, whenever a policy decision is made, whenever we choose to do something, there is this intent with collective action that we are going to achieve certain outcomes. And through the actual implementation and the experience, we determine if those outcomes are actually achieved or not achieved. But there's also the potential, and this happens almost always in the development and implementation of policy or of actions of government, where there are things that happen that aren't intended, that have an external impact, and we know these as externalities. And these are the unintended consequences of policy, the unintended consequences of an action. Of course, through physics, we learned that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, but that reaction can be very dispersed in terms of how it is felt when it comes to policy, when it comes to what government does or what a nonprofit does. And so we find ourselves in a situation that there's going to be external effects that go beyond the actual intent of the policy. And these can either be positive or negative. They can either be beneficial or they can be non-beneficial. They can be a negative effect. They can be a destructive effect. And in my work, particularly when it comes to the fact that I'm primarily involved with determining the allocation of resources in my role in budgeting, my interest is always in wanting to know, along with actually achieving what you say you're going to achieve and the odds of achieving that, my interest is always in what is it that happens that you weren't expecting, the externalities. And I'll give you an example that's very basic but kind of proves the point, and it's a positive externality. So before we built the event center here in Rocky Mount, the city had an opportunity to travel to Durham and meet with the staff at DPAC, the Durham Performing Arts Center, which as a facility, despite the significant amount of public opposition to the project when it was first proposed in the early 2000s, has actually been a very successful public venue for the city of Durham, both in terms of the events it's held and also the economic development, economic impact that it's had on the downtown Durham area and on the identity and reputation of Durham overall. So when we were meeting with the people who had been involved in this project from the beginning, I asked them, I said, obviously you were able to achieve what you wanted to achieve with this project, which was to bring in Broadway major touring Broadway shows, first run national tours. You were able to achieve that, and you had that. What were the unexpected results of it? What were the things that you didn't anticipate? And what they told me was that when they built the facility, they were not expecting a lot of off-night usage. They were primarily expecting the place to be used for multi-week engagements with these Broadway shows or with other plays. They had built it as a theatrical facility. It's a very nice theatrical facility. If you ever had a chance to go inside and also especially look backstage, it has all the accoutrement you need. But they had not necessarily intended it to be a successful venue for one-night acts. And what they found was that there were a lot of acts out there that had followings of substance that they could come in for a one-night show and do very well. They have the ability at DPAC to be able to close off the upper levels, to put drapes over the upper levels to create a more intimate space in the primary level in the first balcony. And that was not something they expected. So like the night we were there, Jay Leno was coming in to do a one-man show as part of his national tour. And, those were the kind of shows they just didn't plan for. But the space could be worked so that they could create the right space that someone like Jay Leno would need. There's also, of course, a lot of these older bands, and I realize that that's relative to respect to the age of the audience here, but acts that were kind of older when I was a kid, that are still performing, that for them, they don't expect to perform in front of 10 or 20,000 people. They want to perform in front of 5,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. And they don't want the whole stage element of it. To them, it's just about, performing their hits and doing that, and can do that with a smaller audience. And so they came in there as well. And so they were able to tell us that they have a very easy time in between their major traveling national tours of these Broadway productions. They have the ability to schedule additional shows, and that brings in a lot of additional ticket buyers, a lot of additional guests, which of course has significant positive impact for DPAC as well as for downtown Durham overall, and has made it a very attractive venue for hosting talent from across the country and around the world. But we also have to ask this question, even though we talk about externalities from an external perspective, is it possible for externalities to also be internalized? And it talks about this in the chapter. That's okay, Shantanu, I'm sorry. Is it possible for externalities, can externalities be internalized?
Absolutely. Yes.
You want to give a possible example thinking about your own experience, JR?
This is, I don't know how to give it a title or whatever, but if you have in my world, a rookie firefighter that it gets very proactive, he goes and gets these specialized training and does very well with it, and he starts to change things. A positive externality of that is people that come on board behind him or her can see this, and they see him or her promote, and they'll see what positive energy this person has. So a positive externality of that is the better proactivity and work ethic that this firefighter expresses throughout the rest of the whole organization.
Excellent. Can I offer a similar negative externality? So let me offer a negative that also involves firefighting. We had a young firefighter like what JR described, and that's typically how they work. JR's description is very accurate, and I've seen it myself with our fire department. We had a firefighter who was a relatively young firefighter who had an interest in technology. And that obviously, when it comes to developing staff, when you have younger staff, their knowledge of technology can be very beneficial. This young man found an interest in trying to figure out how to apply Google Glass. If for those of you remember what Google Glass was, it was around just a couple of years ago. But he wanted to figure out a way that they could use a pair of Google glasses to be able to help them in responding to a fire scene, being able to see maps, being able to see other things. So he actually was able to find a way to write some software to develop an application that would tie into our system that would enable him to use the Google glasses in the field. And this was a great development, and we were looking to really maximize on this. The only problem was that it also made him very attractive to outside companies that were interested in working with him. And sure enough, about 9 months after he developed the technology, and we totally believe him that this was not his intent. He was very much sad that he was leaving us, but he left us to work for a software company. So, from a negative perspective, you've made that investment for those of you who know, when you're providing advanced and specialized training to staff people, whether it's in police, fire, electric linemen, water plant operators, whatever the case may be, that training has a cost to it. And it's your goal to try to recover that cost with a certain number of years of service, typically at least 3 to 5 years of service. And we did not get 5 years of service out of this kid. Now, we didn't penalize him for it. He had already met the terms of his agreement, which I believe with us was for his fire training, which was 2 years. And this was training he had gotten on his own and hadn't asked us to pay for it. But the reality was that we still lost a firefighter who could have been very, very good for us long term. So we lost that when losing him. Again, there was no malice or anything like that tied to it, but it's the reality that we face in this type of work, particularly working with those. You want to encourage the development of your staff. If you're in a supervisory position now or in the future, you definitely want to encourage the development, especially that self-motivated element of development. You want to encourage that. One of the potential externalities of it is that it can make them available for additional opportunities outside of your organization. And that is something you kind of have to keep in mind, but it does not mean we've gone away from a mentality that was in place many generations ago, or not many generations, only a few generations ago, that was very common in many places, where they would purposely try not to develop people because they wanted to keep them at their level so they could keep them focused on what they were doing within an organization. It was kind of an ownership mentality in terms of that person's abilities. And we've moved away from that, thankfully. But it does mean that you are susceptible to the possibility that somebody can develop skills tied to what they're doing for you, but kind of extending what they can also do for others, and find themselves in a position where they become where they can market those skills outside of your organization and eventually leave your organization. And there are plenty of examples out there if you take a look at them. Imagine some of y'all deal with those a little more directly in your various fields of work from time to time. Are there any questions with respect to this slide? Okay. So let's go back to the concept of collective action. What do we mean by collective action? Just what's a good general definition? I think we all kind of have an idea, but someone give it a shot.
When you're just thinking about teamwork and participation, so they give the example of a protest. So if it's going to be successful, you're going to need lots of people. The more people that show up, the more successful it might be in moving the needle.
Right, where the ability to act together has a benefit greater than just simply the sum of those involved. Where you start extrapolating a benefit beyond just the individual value of each person's participation. Protest is the best example of that. The larger a group gets, the magnitude of its impact increases significantly. And so that's obviously the goal. And it kind of ties into this first point I make with respect to collective action, looking at the group outcome versus the personal cost. Where in a situation where collective action is most effective, and this gets a little bit into the math, but I won't go there. The thing you have to think about is that the outcome of the group, that the value that's created by the group's outcome is greater than the increased value of that person's personal cost. So as you see those increments, the increment of group outcome increases at a higher level than the increment of personal cost. Yes, Tim.
So in the nonprofit world, we would call this collective impact, right? So
Yes.
It's a strategy that nonprofits will use who are sort of in the same sphere of influence to share resources and collectively have a shared voice or a shared program of some sort to, manage and spread their impact farther and wider than they would if they were to work on their own.
Right, absolutely. And it's the focus of most of what we do in public policy. It's not our intent to do everything for everybody. That is not our intent, especially in this country. But our goal when it comes to public policy and the work we do should always be to focus on those responsibilities where there is a definite opportunity and oftentimes need to try to achieve these kind of results, where we then look at it from purely a cost benefit analysis at the individual level. Obviously, a lot of times when collective action, those people who are involved in that action are going to incur cost and achieve benefits. But then it comes to the societal benefits, which ideally are still greater than simply the sum of individual benefits, that you are enabling us to be able to yield a benefit that's simply greater than the amount of cost, than the yield, the benefit over cost at the individual level. So one example of that is with taxation. And Aaron, I'll get to you in just a second. But one example would be with taxation. When you decide that a particular service or responsibility of government is going to be funded with taxation, you are incurring an individual cost. Everybody is having to pay something, or a certain population of the public is having to pay something. And the goal is that obviously that cost is going to hopefully yield a benefit to that individual, but hopefully it yields a more significant benefit to society. So let me start off with Aaron, and then I'll go to Christopher. Tim, did you want to put your hand back down, or did you have another thing to say? Okay. All right. Let me start with Aaron. Aaron, this talks about the prisoner's dilemma. Aaron, do you want to explain the prisoner's dilemma?
I can try. I always
Okay.
forget, like, intricate aspects of it.
That's okay.
Essentially, two people are brought in for a crime they're alleged to have commit, and they're separated to be interrogated. And the analysis is something like, if one of them snitches on the other one, then the person who snitches will go free and the other person will get, say, like 5 years. If they both snitch, they will both get 5 years. But if no one snitches, no one gets any time. And so
Right.
collectively, it's better for neither of them to snitch, but when they're making the decision separately, the rational choice for each individual person is to actually tell on the other person, which in return will actually have a net loss of 10 years for both of them.
Right. It's again, and also academically, we use the word confess, not snitch, or confess or provide information. Snitch, confess isn't the right word, or tell the truth or provide information. Snitch is not the word we would use academically. But you're absolutely right. The idea being that there is and the analysis you gave is correct. Christopher, what do you want to say?
Well, so this might be skipping ahead a little bit, but it plays into the iterative play of the prisoner's dilemma. But I think the biggest collective action problem, at least in my work, is climate change on the international level. There is that motivation for less developed nations to not to use the fossil fuels in the way that currently developed nations did to get where we are, but that produces the less optimal outcome. And given that iterative play that I'm sure you're going to talk about, the prisoner's dilemma, it changes that dynamic to get results like we've seen, like the Paris Climate Agreement, and hopefully something better at the next COP in Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue that a lot of people have when it comes to this environmental focus, is that there are plenty of countries out there that simply either don't have access to the technology or don't have access to the capital necessary to implement the technology to go ahead and advance, to basically skip a generation in energy development and move on to something without going through a stage similar to what we've gone through in our past with fossil fuels. And the thought being is, that obviously because that rollout of basically skipping a generation of energy or an era of energy to move on to something that is viewed to be more environmentally friendly, obviously puts them at a potential disadvantage with economic development in the present. And I want to be clear about that. We're talking about in the present day. And that there is, of course, a cost, obviously, you think about your own cost and benefits, as opposed to looking at collective benefit associated with that action. Is that what you're basically referring to, Chris?
Yeah, the sort of the inability to fund, I guess that current cost
Right.
It's a
Right,
method of
because
discounting the future.
right, because these newer methods have still not been scaled to the point where their implementation costs are at the same level as prior generations of energy. So let's look at it. So one other thing we have to take, and this kind of takes into consideration something else we have to look at, known as probability of success. The text talks about this a little bit from a mathematical perspective, but one of the things we have to take into consideration is that just because we have to remember that just because we have collective action doesn't mean that success is necessarily guaranteed. And so there's the issue of probability of success. How does, however, collective action influence the probability of success based on the reading?
It's based on diffuse and concentrated interests.
Okay, so explain that a little bit.
So a diffuse interest would be the American public's benefits from the American government taking a different position on climate change. And the concentrated interest in that scenario would be fossil fuel companies. Say, you know, if policy were to outlaw fossil fuels in 10 years, the concentrated interest would be those fossil fuel companies, because they would have the most to lose. And there are
everybody tied, and also everybody tied to that industry,
right,
directly tied to that industry. Let's for example, we learned only in the last couple of weeks that the University of Texas gets several $1 million a day off oil leases that goes into their endowment, which will eventually very soon make them the richest university in terms of endowment in the country. You know, theoretically 10 years from now, that may not be the case if you were to ban fossil fuels in 10 years. So this is kind of, that's something we have to take into consideration, that obviously in many cases, there are already interests that are established on both sides of a given policy action, whether it be climate change, gun control, even more local issues. Like I'll give you one local example here in Rocky Mount with our event center. Typically, when you build a facility like an event center, which is a multi-purpose, which in its true nature is a multi-purpose facility, we can do traveling youth sports tournaments, we can do meetings, concerts, a whole host of activities. Typically, when you build a facility like that at the scale that we build it, you also want a hotel next door to it. You want there to be lodging accommodations either connected to or within a very short walk. And by short walk, I mean like less than 100 yards from given facility. And this, when we built the facility, we did not build it with a hotel because we figured that eventually somebody would come to us once they saw the success of the facility and want to build a hotel, and that we wouldn't have to pay for it. But the reality, of course, is that you soon find out that in order to get the events, and this has been one of the this has been something that's very consistent, that when you want in order to get the events, people, particularly who want to have multi-day events there or stuff like that, or want the hotel nearby. Now, Rocky Mount, because of its proximity to I-95, has several nice hotels, but they're closer to I-95. The event center is downtown, so there's about a 10 to 12 minute drive from the hotels that we currently have to the event center. So naturally, because those hotels have investors, some of whom are local, some of whom are not, that are based at the interstate, they present an interest that sees the value of the event center and the fact that they're currently getting the hotel room buys for that. And they're not necessarily, unless they decide to be the investor on the hotel, on the event center site, necessarily going to be excited about building a hotel next to the event center. It has the potential to pull rooms from them. And so as a result, we've had several challenges when it comes to public comments about public participation, the city's participation in incentivizing a hotel on there. The main incentive we would be doing would be in the form of a parking deck. That would be the main incentive that we would be providing for such a site. And It's something that would need to be done. And it is a way to incentivize not only the hotel, but also provide an additional amenity to the event center. And parking decks can be structured in such a way that their net cost after you pay for parking rentals and such is minimal. Many cities do this. But the reality is that you create a situation where you have these competing interests, and simply there is not enough collective action in the public to push the issue forward to where you deal with where you're able to deal with the opposition interest effectively. So that's the problem that we have there. That's a more local example. The other examples, of course, that a lot of times appear with this are more national or global. But then we also have to ask ourselves this. Obviously participation can get to a point where it can be socially optimal to achieve these results. But the question we have to ask ourselves in this social dilemma is it that socially optimal participation is desirable? Is it desirable to have socially optimal participation?
I would say in most cases, yes, because you're going to have fewer instances where I think that the text had it as B and C, where your benefit is going to be lower for your cost. And it mentioning the earlier chapters about having a larger pie versus a smaller pie.
Right. Where could it potentially not be desirable?
I hope that's open to the whole floor and not just me.
Yes, it's open to the whole floor. It's not just open to you. Where is it possible? And this I don't remember exactly if it's covered very well in the book, but where would it not be necessarily desirable?
And in a courtroom, but there's before you get to that, and I wouldn't say legislator per se, because I think that might be where it should be that way, but it's not, obviously. But Supreme Court cases, of course, I know it's beyond that point when time it gets to them, but something, whatever it's called before it gets to there, whatever it is.
Appellate level?
Thank you. Mine was completely blank. Thank you. That's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah, that's okay. But let's think of it from the perspective that we have to remember in all that we do that there are fundamental individual rights, that there are fundamental individual natural rights. And we have to remember in the course of our work that even the most socially optimal result cannot serve to infringe upon natural individual rights. Now, y'all can take those to mean different things. I'm not here to get into a discussion about what natural rights are directly, but we have to remember that there are particular restrictions on our powers of authority. We have seen socially optimal participation lead to some unfortunate moments in our history that have happened, which have resulted in the loss of individual rights for particular individuals or entire sections of people, so entire groups of people. I apologize for saying sections, groups of people. And we have to keep that in mind because we have to remember there's this idea that it's not talked about much in this book, but it's something that we have to keep mindful of in the discussion of rights and liberties and the role of democracy in our republic, and that's the tyranny of the majority, which, obviously socially optimal goes beyond majority. It can go to supermajority levels. But we have to keep that in mind because just because there is socially optimal levels of support and participation for a particular cause or action does not necessarily mean it should happen, because even regardless of the perceived societal benefit, however it's quantitatively valued or qualitatively valued, there is still the potential for the loss of individual rights, which are supposed to remain, which particularly in this country are supposed to remain the primary responsibility of government. Yes, Chris. Your internet's breaking up.
So this level was for, okay. I'll retract.
Okay. Lindsay brings up an example. Would an example be destroying native land for some beneficial natural resource? That would be a good example. We have lands in this country that are protected for indigenous populations. And there have been times in more recent years where there has been discussion about making those lands available for resource extraction or the delivery of resources. This was one of the issues that wasn't talked about much by either side in their discussions regarding the Keystone XL pipeline. There was the fact, I mean, something that was totally looked over by both the left and right in that discussion of whether to continue with the construction of Keystone XL or not, was the fact that it was going to cross over indigenous reservation lands. And the reality was that was never, that issue had not been properly handled before we got to that point, and then it was just kind of left alone once the project was scrubbed. But just private property rights in general. We're in a different place now with private property rights in this country due to the Kelo decision, which is almost 20 years old now, which expanded the use of eminent domain by governments to extend into economic development. Prior to that, public purpose for eminent domain was a little more conservatively constructed, that it had to be more to the direct use for public service. Now with the Kelo decision, which has not been struck down, the Kelo decision still stands. It has been mitigated in some states by their state laws in terms of the powers of local governments and state and local governments, but it has not been reduced at the federal level. Governments do have the ability, if allowed within their state, to be able to take private land for eminent domain, i.e. for public use, with the idea that you're providing economic development support. Yes, Chris.
So I think I should be good now. The question I was asking is, this is just related to the social participation of an optimal social participation, not necessarily the actual output.
No, I understand
right?
what you're saying. I understand.
If there's a actual output, then are there instances where that would not be desirable? I guess is my question.
Well, definitely, because that's where externalities come from. Externalities reflect the output, and that's definitely a truth too. But sometimes, we can learn even with what you're talking about participation. We can sometimes learn where the participation itself, we know what the potential implications to natural rights are as they're defined by law. We can deal with those. For example, there's a huge push, and granted, there's a lot of discussion about that, but there's of course a huge push and particularly in certain states like Texas, for border security. One of the things we have to remember in border security is that most of the land that is on the border with Mexico is private land. And the question then becomes, how do the private landowners feel about certain interventions by the government in accessing that land and developing that land to ensure border security? And you can see that from the beginning. There is the ability that we can learn, and this gets to the whole issue of learning from, and this goes a little bit beyond the book. This goes from learning from what goes on in government policy to know that if certain actions are going to happen, you're going to have, if certain decisions are going to be made, certain actions are coming. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So And that's as true with and a lot, and it's not just land rights. Land rights are easier to explain because it's a little more concrete, but also it applies to human rights. It also definitely applies to human rights as well. And it's like the broader issue. And I think Mary Cole, you brought up this several times with respect to education and some of the discussions we're now having in terms of how we treat the money that's given to schools and understanding the potential implications there. We're not at a point yet where we've even achieved socially optimal participation in those policy debates, but we're not at that point. But as we get there, there's the possibility for having to really look at what the effects are going to be and hopefully understanding what those effects are going to be before decisions are made one way or another. And thank you very much for the film suggestion. Now, we also have to remember that, and one of the challenges we have, and it's a given in any situation, is we have these wonderful people or wonderful entities known as free riders. That happens all the time. So Mary, I wanted to ask you, give me let's first see someone else define what a free rider is.
Someone who benefits from a public good but doesn't exactly like take steps to like pay for it.
Somebody who benefits, who doesn't contribute. Absolutely. So Mary, you're the one probably here with the most university experience. Can you describe a university free rider? And I apologize for putting you on the spot, but I thought I would give it a shot.
No. I mean, I think one pretty easy one is the fact that we're a public campus. And so, tuitions, fees, like everything that kind of goes into it from like the state level to pay for the upkeep and salaries of people who, keep the campus up and running. There are people who come onto our campus every single day who don't contribute $1 or I mean, technically everybody does through your taxes, but it's not like a direct university contribution. But they enjoy the benefits of the university. It's a little bit harder. You might have like one in mind, but
I was thinking was thinking more particularly the library.
The library.
The people who go into the library, obviously they can't use the computers because y'all got them locked, but people who read the magazines, read the books, they still do a lot of research in there. Lindsay brings up going to Duke all the time, and I'm all for that. But the reality is that universities, even though there is public support provided to those universities in general, it's very clear that that basically just keeps the lights on, the water running, and the buildings from falling down. That the ability for those universities to operate, as well as for the libraries to have the resources that they have, are made possible by the actual daily business of the university, which is, higher education, the money that y'all pay in tuition and fees. Anything else you want to add?
I was going to say this might be a little harsh, but it's kind of funny.
Okay.
I deal with it a lot. But one thing that happens a lot in my shop, and I mean, I get a lot of emails about it because my name's out there and people find it. People write to complain about the way that we're doing things, or want to have an opinion about, what's being taught or said. And then they'll say, well, I'll never give another dime to the university. And 9 times out of 10, we'll look them up in the system and they haven't given a dime to the university except for their like season football tickets that they order every year.
Yeah.
Which is great. But so we get kind of an interesting mix of free riders, like people who feel like they're contributing in some way, but don't really understand like the scope of what the university is. And so,
right.
Yeah.
So one of the common issues we run into in municipal governments in North Carolina is pretty much all municipalities, particularly cities, not as much towns, but some towns do this as well, but particularly cities operate park systems. We build and construct parks, which include playgrounds, tennis courts, basketball courts, the whole 9 yards, for the benefit of our communities. And we know without question that there's a lot of people who use those facilities who are not city residents. And unless we get grant money from from the state or from the federal government for certain capital projects, those are funded out of tax obligations. And so we know, for example, here in Rocky Mount, the county does have some parks, but the towns don't. Well, town of Nashville does, but none of the other towns in Nash County have parks that they contribute to. The county runs parks and the city runs parks. And we know that we have a lot of residents who come from other towns or come from the unincorporated areas of the county who use our parks. And so these individuals don't directly contribute. Now, what they'll say is, well, I pay sales tax. And because the way sales tax is distributed, they look at it as, well, they say that that's their contribution, but it's not direct. But we realize, I mean, this is an acceptable aspect of what we do. We know that it's going to happen, just like Mary knows there's going to be people that are going to use the university that don't directly contribute to the university. There's that happens all the time, and you kind of have to accept it. But at the same time, it is something that we always have to be aware of. We try to address that in some ways in the fact that typically when municipalities like offer athletic leagues or admission rates for different amenities that are fee-based for recreation, they typically charge inside city or inside jurisdiction and outside jurisdiction rates. And if you don't live in the jurisdiction, that's fine. You can still participate, but you got to pay a higher fee. So that's something that a lot of jurisdictions do. Not saying all do, but many jurisdictions do implement. So somebody brought up public good. What's a public good? What are some characteristics of a public good?
Are you? Oh, go ahead.
No, you
can.
got to
Are you sure?
be my guest.
I was just going to say the two characteristics are that they're non-excludable, so everyone has access to them, and then they're non-rival, so my using the good doesn't reduce your access to the good. So something
Right.
like national defense or clean air, etc.
Exactly. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are infinite, but it does mean that they're not in a situation where just because you use perhaps more than somebody else does theoretically, like example water, that it doesn't mean that you're necessarily cutting somebody off, that we, by providing the service, are guaranteeing access for everybody. Now, sometimes you may have to take certain measures in order to ensure access to everybody. That's why, we implement water conservation measures in certain cases. That's why we have legislation like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. But the goal isn't to prohibit people from being able to access what they need in a given situation, or to make it to where there's to eliminate that non-rival position. But then there's those other ones where it is really hard to define how much we use of it compared to somebody else, like military defense, public safety, fire protection. It's really hard to quantify how much one person uses of a public good compared to another. In those cases, the thoughts are relatively proportional. And those proportions can be derived different ways, but generally speaking, the thoughts are pretty proportional to the population as a whole. Chris brought up a good definition of diffuse versus concentrated interest. For the sake of reminding us, can somebody else define what the difference is between diffuse and concentrated interest?
I would just say diffuse interests are shared by a larger number of people, and concentrated interests are shared by smaller numbers.
Correct. And we definitely see that in a lot of cases. Overall, we definitely see that pretty regularly. And so we have to be aware of that, because typically when we have diffuse interest, things are okay. But in those situations with concentrated interest, you can have serious issues. Like one example that we've been dealing with in the that the General Assembly's been dealing with that's a concentrated interest has to do with the availability of gambling. Gambling is obviously, well, we have lotteries in North Carolina, so gambling is not totally illegal in the state of North Carolina. Private gambling is illegal except for certain types of bingo operations, unless you're on an Indian reservation where gambling is allowed to a certain extent. But, you know, we've had these conversations that have happened more recently, including this past year, where the General Assembly is starting to look at what other states are looking at in terms of providing gambling to provide private gambling access on general property in the state. Particularly, there's a very strong interest in sports betting because sports betting is pretty much considered, it's a known to exist everywhere and has existed for a long time. Up until a couple of years ago, there was only one place in America where it could legally happen, and that was Nevada. The Supreme Court struck down the federal laws that established that, which made it then available in all 50 states, so long as the states allowed it. Many states have gone on and made sports betting legal because they realized it was happening anyway. And it does not carry the same perceptions that illegal drugs do. So it's treated differently. Not saying that that's right. It just is treated differently by a larger segment of society than drugs are. So it has been made legal in many states. There were efforts to try to legalize, and Charisma, you're absolutely right. Seniors love to gamble.
Yeah, they're like obsessed
say again?
with it. They do it definitely. They're like, I'm in the library now because I ended up coming to campus, but they're obsessed with it. They gamble with bingo, and then they just talk about like gambling, and they do Pokeno also. But yeah.
Yeah, and Keno's the gambling version of crack. It's really hard, in my opinion, for the state to say anything about gambling when they operate Keno, which is gambling on crack. I mean, nothing against people who play it, but if you were to, I mean, for those of you, Keno is basically it's a lottery played every 5 minutes is the easiest way to describe, or 5-10 minutes, whatever they do with the state system. But it's basically a lottery played every 5 to 10 minutes. It's got a little different rule set, but one of my favorite experiences of graduate school in Georgia had legalized Keno when I was there, and I went into a convenience store where this was back in the early 2000s, so it was still a green screen it was a green screen monitor that brought the numbers up, and it was in the back room. And the only reason I went there, I didn't go to play Keno, is the fact that they sold coffee for 25 cents a cup. And clearly they were doing that to keep people there to play Keno, but I would just go in there and buy coffee. But that was, and of course now you can't even find coffee for $2 at most places, but you know, back in the good old days. But what happened in the legislative debate was that the interests were very concentrated, both for and against. There were obviously concentrated interests that wanted to legalize it, and there were concentrated interests that wanted to keep it illegal, who primarily are opposed for it for the most part moral reasons or perceived moral reasons. And what was interesting about it was that it crossed political aisles. There was a group of Democrats and Republicans that were for it, and there was a group of Democrats and Republicans who were against it. And it eventually did not reach the consensus necessary for it to happen. Keno is how it's spelled. Keno, Keno. Features very prominently at the end of Vegas Vacation, of National Lampoon's Vegas Vacation. So, you know, that's just one example, but there are many different examples. And typically what you want to try to achieve is a situation with diffuse interest. Concentrated interest can be a challenge because they can definitely have a significant amount of influence. And that's not to say the influence isn't positive, but a lot of times concentrated interest, if they are successful, you have a greater potential for negative externalities in my experience. So you have to be careful with it. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It's just something that you have to be careful about. And it's something that you're going to run into in whatever work you do. Many of you who work in the field already have experienced it firsthand. So it is something that you have to be aware of. One of the biggest challenges we do also have in our space is dealing with when we have situations where we have goods that are non-excludable, but there is a potential for a rival environment where the access, where what one takes can deter and prevent another takes, where it's finite and rival. And that creates this concept that we know of as tragedy of the commons. The example with the fisheries is a prime example of that. You have a finite fisheries or fish hatcheries, as they're also, as we knew them back in Tennessee, produce a certain amount of fish on a regular basis. My grandfather had a guy that worked for him that always took the same day off every week. And the reason why was because that was the day that the hatchery at the lake nearby always let out the trout. So he would drive up to that lake, go to the hatchery, and set his pole in there about 30 minutes before the outtake on the hatchery let out. And he'd catch his limit. He wouldn't go over his limit, but he'd easily catch his limit and then go home. And he did that just about every week for about 20 years. So the reality is that that's there weren't 20, it was in the middle of the week, so it wasn't something that everybody could do. But the reality is you could have a situation where a small number of people working within the boundaries of what's allowed, if you have a rival, if you have a good which is rival and not truly a public good, but is perceived to be a public good, could create a situation where there can be problems. This is especially true with pollution. Probably the best examples we can think of tragedy, the common situations have to do with pollution. Air pollution caused by industrial sites or by particular types of activity, water pollution, ground pollution, people not taking care of themselves, not taking care of what they dump. Those kind of situations are very common. A lot of times we see examples of this in environmental situations. So this is something that we have to be mindful of, and oftentimes requires us, in order to prevent these situations, it requires us to move forward with policy interventions. We do our best to try to persuade. We try our best. And I would say this in general, when you're in government, it is best that you try to minimize your use of coercive power to as minimal as possible. There's certainly some areas where we could learn to do this more frequently and be less coercive. I'm not saying that. In areas that however, as areas change, we try to do our best to be persuasive and not be coercive. And so persuasion is something we try to do a lot. And the most common way we use persuasion is through education. We try to explain what the negative impacts, we try to appeal to people's better nature. It's very important in our work. It's very important in our work, and I'll be philosophical for a second. It's very important in our work that we always try to our best ability when we're working to the public as a whole, not specific individuals, but the public as a whole, that we try to believe in the best of them, that we try to believe in them as being good, as being responsible, as being rational. It can be a challenge, no doubt. It is also important that we do our best to approach our work from the perspective that people are inherently good. Not everybody agrees with that. I remember I used to work with somebody who worked for Jesse Helms. Some of y'all probably, I imagine, Tim, you know who Jesse Helms is. Yep. Jesse Helms was a former senator of North Carolina, probably the most significant. He also used to be the owner of WRAL long ago before Capital Broadcasting bought it. But he also, Jesse Helms was probably one of the most firebrand senators, particularly from the Republican side, that we had throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I worked with somebody who was a staffer for him, and when I told him what I thought, she said, well, that's not what he thought. He thought people were inherently not good. Which kind of, I didn't have a high opinion of him before, and certainly didn't have a high opinion of him after that. But there are plenty of people in power on both sides of the aisle who feel the same way. That's what experience has also taught me. But the reality is that that in our work, in order to be able to be effective with it and to understand our role, we, even with all the examples and all the history that we have, we still have a responsibility to do our best when it comes to society as a whole, to try to believe in the best and trying to believe them as inherently good. That does not mean that there aren't times where we can simply just use persuasion. There are times where through our processes, we develop more coercive or more direct action approaches, such as the utilization of taxes. We talked about that in our original example in the first class with respect to how we can address carbon emissions through different approaches, including the uses of a tax system, or the use of subsidies. And we see subsidies used considerably now in economic development, and subsidies are also used in other ways. So these are things that we have to take into consideration as well. Are there any questions at this point? So a lot of times when we're developing policy, a lot of times we are not able to achieve an optimal result. And that leads us to this idea of the theory of the second best. What is, somebody summarize that for me? I kind of led into it, but somebody theorized, kind of just explain to me. Yes, Chris.
So one of the key takeaways that I had is to get to the second best, you have to use some form of incentive, either through taxation or subsidy or something like that, and to have the resources to do those actions takes resources. So there's no way to get to, you can't subsidize your way to that optimal point, because the more that you have to spend for that subsidy, the more that you're taking away from the general resource pool for that subsidy.
Right. It's like, theoretically, you could look at our healthcare policy as an example of this. We've determined, generally speaking, the policymakers have determined, with the exception of a few that are still really pushing for the idea of a nationalized single payer system, that the resources and the allocation, the need to raise the resources and allocate the resources and even expand the resources don't add up to go to a true nationalized single payer system. So we've kind of created this hodgepodge guaranteed managed care approach, where we use the existing private market and we simply try to guarantee accessibility within the private market. So we don't change everything. We simply just try to provide enough subsidy or assistance to provide services to those who would not be able to obtain them otherwise. And of course, you still deal with trade-offs even in those situations. Yes, Chris.
I did also want to say, when dealing with the healthcare like that, one of those inefficiencies that you run into is the opposite side of providing subsidies. And, how we rely on a private system, there will always have to be a profit margin. So that's the, private sector side of the subsidy, that no matter, as long as you're using that private sector system, you cannot get to an optimum number, whatever that be, how many people insure, whatever it costs, because you have to have that built.
Absolutely. No, there's no question about that. And that's why public pensions invest in stocks. But no, you're absolutely right. But the reality is that very rarely, hardly ever, do we ever achieve an optimum policy. We always have to accept the reality of trade-offs. And in healthcare, we have that, and in other areas of policy, we definitely see that. Even with, I mean, because even in areas of environmental policy, we've had that. I mean, that's it, particularly when we see the issue of diverse and concentrated interest when it comes to setting environmental policy. Because the reality is, the question when it comes to environmental policy is how much policy do you implement to improve the environment and at the same time not cause negative extra economic impact. That is obviously something we have to keep in mind. And of course, that also deals with taking short-term interest or present-day interest in respect to perceived long-term interest. So those are factors we have to consider as well. Now, that does not mean that there aren't other ways that we can look at it. So there are these alternative responses that we can apply. Obviously, if we think that everybody's inherently good, we try to appeal to altruistic perspectives. We try to advance altruism. What are some of the challenges with altruism? And I have my headphone on. I'm going to turn on my light. So hold on, but y'all go ahead. Go ahead if anybody has one.
I mean, something that comes to mind is the fact that everyone can have a different moral code, so the motivation for altruism can be completely different. And hard to
Absolutely.
navigate.
Absolutely. Anything else?
So altruism, if you have, a majority of people doing an extra amount of work to get to that social optimum, then you also have more of an incentive for somebody that was going to free ride because they have to do even less work to get to that social optimum.
Absolutely. You have a greater potential for a free rider problem. Absolutely. So then we have private markets, and we obviously use private markets a lot in this country. We use private markets a lot. As Chris pointed out earlier, we still have the fact that private markets, there's still the profit, which is a necessity in private markets. Private markets can't exist without it. But it does create a trade-off with respect to the allocation of resources. There is, with respect to public goods. I had a citizen who last night brought up, we've been having challenges like a lot of cities have had with solid waste collection, with garbage collection. And he brought up the idea, and we run residential garbage collection here as a city. He wanted us to look at outsourcing it to a private provider. There are private vendors out there that will do it. And that is an option that's out there, but there are trade-offs to that. I will also tell you that I worked for a city where we did privately outsource garbage, and we had a situation where on a Friday afternoon, the private contractor that we had called us up and said, we went bankrupt. We went Chapter 7 and we're out. And so by the following Tuesday, we had to find another contractor to use to provide the service. We were lucky that we were in a market where there were other contractors, but we still had a problem with that. So it doesn't always work the way you intend it to work. And then we talked about with the prisoner's dilemma. Yes, Chris.
I was just going to say on that citizen's point that it gets to the question of public dollars to private institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it like, for example, we cities and counties and states and even the federal government, we spend a lot of money in the private market. We have to. We can't do even when for the stuff we're responsible for, we still have to rely on the private market to either provide the goods or the services in order to deliver it. And there are questions that our council asks about times where does it make sense for us to obviously there's been a big push over the last 30 years to outsource more. I have a council that, due to what we're seeing, particularly with the fact that costs are going up with these contractors, that have asked us to look at how we can bring more stuff in. We've actually done that in one area. in our water department, because it made more sense for us to simply hire the staff to do the job than it did to pay a contractor to do it. These are things that we have to be mindful of in the course of our work. And then we talk about, ongoing relationships, self-organization. We've already brought up the prisoner dilemma. We have to keep those in mind. Are there any other questions with respect to chapter 4?
Is there a good resource either in this book or a resource somewhere that could what the terms and some of these formulas mean? Because I get a little lost. I'm fairly math intuitive, but it feels like he doesn't say what half the terms mean half of the time.
No, he doesn't. Let me look in the prior book that I used and see how he describes how the author in that prior book describes it. There are some instructional aids that I got from this. There are no instructional aids with this book because it's not truly intended as a textbook. The other book was. So there might be some aids that I might be able to pull from the prior book that I can share, but I'll need to see.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So what I would like to do now is to go back to the discussion of externalities. And what I'm going to do is there are 18 students on this call, so I'm going to split you up into 6 groups of 3 groups of 6. What I'd like for y'all to do is spend about 15 minutes talking about some of the externalities that you noticed with respect to our policy response to COVID. You have obviously lived through this and you all have probably read some things. And I would like for y'all just to take, what I'd like for each group to do is identify at least one positive externality and at least one negative externality with respect to the policies that have been implemented. Think about, lockdown, school closures, mask wearing, all the different policies that you've heard about, vaccines and others. And each group identify at least one positive externality and one negative externality. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes. So, and then we'll bring everybody back together to discuss, and then we will wrap up. So let me set up the groups. These will be random. So I will be opening the groups now, and you will have 15 minutes. Thank you.
meeting is being recorded.
Okay. So, what I'd like, everybody hear me? Okay, good. All right. So, what I'd like to do is just those of you, so who would like to go first with a positive, and then we'll do one first group that wants to go. Understood. Understood, Lindsay. Sorry about that. Try to keep that in mind next time. I realize that in some ways Zoom is convenient, and in other ways it's not. And I've noticed that tonight. So, but I appreciate everybody for their participation. So what I'd like to do is let's start off with one positive externality. Who wants to go?
I can share from our group.
Sure.
So one of the positives that we talked about was the impact of digital literacy, and just how, you know, if the pandemic hadn't happened and things hadn't shut down the way that they did, you know, we might not be able to do a class like this on Zoom today. Probably not. And with that, it kind of had additional further positive impacts, like on flexible work and things like that, and just being able to meet with people, you know, all over the place. Some might say Zoom is a negative externality, but we talked about it as more of a positive, and just increasing that, schools as well.
Well, certainly the ability for us to see that we can do things differently, and that the technology that we had kind of been thinking was out there, but really had not been forced to utilize, and found it that for many applications, not all applications, but for many applications, it was an acceptable alternative. Like, for example, for meetings that I'm going to start hosting tomorrow night for ARPA purposes, we're going to have hybrids where we will allow people to join by Zoom, because we realize even if we're having a meeting at 7 o'clock, not everybody in the community can get to a place at 7 o'clock. So we want to make sure people have a chance to participate. Okay, so what's a negative?
From our group as well. Or
Well, let someone else from your group
okay.
go.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought negative externality was the effect on mental health. We talked about it particularly in the school system. So you talked about kids not participating in sports or socializing as much. And then they also brought up points about, you know, children having trouble communicating online or not having the same resources. So
yeah, the situation definitely brought out the disparity issues in resource accessibility, particularly when it comes to digital access, but also just access in general. That definitely became very visible as a result of it. It made, I think, a lot of policymakers, politicians, and the public in general more aware of just how even services that are supposed to be universally available, like within a particular state or even nationally, aren't necessarily that way in general, that the distribution of them is not consistent, particularly with respect to meeting the needs of the people who need those services. So what's next? Let's go to another group, positive.
One of the positives that we talked about in my group was the reduction of air pollution. Since everyone was staying at home, they weren't traveling to work. And so that really helped in the reduction of carbon emissions. Absolutely.
There was definitely some visible and quantifiable reductions in air pollution due to suspension of just normal activity that occurred as a result of it. So in your group, what was a negative? Anyone?
We talked about like supply chain disruptions and and how that is a negative, but also like could be a positive in the sense that you examine like your own internal production and whether or not it needs to change.
Well, I mean, yes, it gives you that opportunity, but the key thing is negative because in certain circumstances, you're talking about necessities. And particularly in the reactivation of society and the fact that production did not catch up with demand. And there were many examples of it. There have been other factors that contributed to it as well, but we obviously had the baby formula shortage, which is still going on in some ways. That's been very prevalent this year. That was the result of many policy actions, and the pandemic definitely contributed to it, but also just generally speaking, the reality that we've gone to a global market for even necessities, and that translates to some challenges when those supply chains are disrupted due to a desire to shut down the economy with respect to how this policy, with respect to various policy implementations, particularly with the way it was done in other countries and how their actions in other countries affected us because of the globalized nature of our market. Okay, so third group, what was a positive?
I don't know. Was that how many groups were there? I don't know.
There were 3.
Oh, okay, I guess that's ours. So 2 of them, a lot of the stuff has been said already, that we were talking about. I'll think of a new one. So a positive, somebody mentioned it. Well, yeah, you already mentioned it. Never mind. It was basically about how people are able to work remotely and allow for better access. And then, yeah, so y'all said a lot of the things we talked about.
Well, going to that remote work, it changed value judgments that people made with respect to their time. And we're still seeing that in particularly with respect to work that can be done from home. And you know, this is a challenge in government that not all of our work can be done from home. There are jobs that can be, but there are a lot of jobs that can't be. They require being out in the field or being at a particular location. But the reality being that for people who are able to do their work from home, it proved that in a lot of cases, the office wasn't as necessary as people had long held that it was, particularly how companies held that office was important. We had the situation that happened in Charlotte a couple of weeks ago where a company that was supposed to establish a North American headquarters there and received about $1 billion of incentives, basically turned down the incentives because they went from being 99% office based to being almost 97% work from home as a result of COVID, and decided to make that a permanent fixture of their operations instead of returning back to the office. So what was a negative in your group?
One of our
That was
group
awesome.
members mentioned job loss, that there were a lot of people who lost their jobs, especially hourly employees.
Yes.
And so while there was, some support from the government, there was still a long time before those job sectors were able to recover.
Absolutely. We disrupted the economy in a lot of ways, and different sectors were able to respond differently. But obviously, and especially if it's a service-based industry where you're providing a direct service to somebody, and especially if it requires physical location in a group, those jobs were suspended per response to policy. And as such, the ability to just recover those jobs is not as simple as saying, hey, it's over, go back to work. There are economic realities that have to be taken into consideration. Anybody else have any others they want to add, positive or negative?
I would say a negative externality would probably be like the whole like shutdown thing. It's kind of like depends like where you live, like in terms of like how like strict it was, like because in the US, like because we like touched on this in our discussion, like in the US it wasn't like that like severe, that you were still able to like like go for a walk and, do other things. But in countries such as India, like they basically confined people to their apartments. So like they basically weren't allowing people to just like step out to like go for a walk or like go grab like groceries or something.
It was like I saw the video of them kicking people out of a temple and using kicking people that were going to daily prayers in a temple. And
yeah, they were like pretty
I mean,
strict about it. Like what they would do is like they basically positioned police at like in like a lot of these neighborhoods to ensure that no one like stepped out of their house like to just like walk, like go for a walk or like do like normal things.
Absolutely. And Charisma, you're right. There were a lot of people, whether it was due to policy, this definitely was, a lot of people felt like prisoners as a result of policy. And again, that depended not just on what country you were with, but part of the United States you were in. But then there were a lot of people, and this gets to the mental health aspect, that due to their receiving of the information that was being shared by public health authorities and how it was being translated into the ether with respect to social media, news broadcasts, and others, developed a tremendous amount of fear with respect to it as well. And as such, felt like they couldn't go out or they were going to die. That was something that also took place. If you're, particularly those who had potential health issues that could result in being considered at higher risk, and obviously that's a situation where that was not probably, that those types of communication issues were not handled as well as they could have been overall, especially for populations that were targeted because of concerns that were valid, but yet the way in which the information was distributed was not necessarily in the best interest mentally. Any other questions or any other comments anybody else would like to make?
Sort of on a related note to what was said, a campus or like university related negative externality, when things shut down, international students are very limited in where they can work. So they can usually only work on campus. Plus, due to the nature of the pandemic, a lot of the university international students, the countries that their relatives were from were completely shut down, and they felt like the prisoners there almost. And so they were not able to get to the bank to wire the students money, and so they were left like high and dry, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, a lot of the speed with which everything happened was unprecedented in terms of decisions being made at a global level. We've never seen anything like this. Even the 2008 financial crisis, where there was considerable global action in a relatively quick manner, particularly with the primary industrialized nations, was still molasses slow compared to what we experienced with COVID. And as Aaron, as you point out, that's going to naturally lead to externalities, because if you're moving with that speed, you're not going to be able to respond to everything that has to be worked out. And of course, then that means people are going to bear the brunt of those decisions in those cases. And that's where, from a policy perspective, we then have to, and from a direct action perspective, we then have to start figuring out how do we address those challenges. That's the same in any disaster, because in any disaster, there are actions that you have to take where you know that there are going to be externalities that then you're going to have to address. You know that it's a given that you're going to have negative externalities that are going to have to be addressed. And so you respond, and then you immediately start working on the next response to deal with those externalities. Okay, so let me come back to this and talk about the assignments for next week. Next week are chapters 5 and 6, continuing our discussion on social dilemmas. Chapter 5 will be covering, this is another important chapter. These are two other important chapters, and they deal a lot with what we're seeing now with respect to policy, and they deal with coordination and commitment, problems in coordination and problems in commitment, and a lot of important discussion. We will be meeting back in class next week, so we will be in the classroom, and I do think these are very important discussions. I need to make sure about some viewing material in the week 5 folder. The reading and lecture assignment will go out either tonight or tomorrow morning. It will be due by 6 p.m. next Tuesday. But you'll receive the email to that. I wait until the class is done to issue the assignment to make sure that we cover everything that's of importance. And then also tomorrow we'll go out the Google form for the group leaders or for each of the groups to select the topics for their group projects. It's first come, first serve. Select up, you'll get a chance to select your top 3 preferences, and the deadline for that will be next Thursday at 8:45. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for the discussion. I hope
Oh,
you
I
all...
have a question.
Yes,
It says
go ahead.
group project. You just said Thursday, but the date on there says Tuesday.
It's Tuesday.
Just like-
Thank you for correcting me. It's Tuesday, the 20th.
Or
Sorry
we're
about
open to
that.
Thursday now.
I know, but I appreciate it. Also, make sure to remember that if you haven't done the podcast 1 assignment, it is due this Thursday, the 15th. So make sure to get that done. And we will discuss it at the beginning of class next week. Anything else? All right. Thank you so much. And I will see you all next Tuesday in class or on Zoom. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.